You've probably been told that a mother's love is nature's most unbreakable instinct. Unconditional, absolute, no exceptions. Here's the uncomfortable part. Across the animal kingdom, mothers eat their own babies more often than you'd think. And it's not a glitch, not madness, not cruelty. It's a calculated, deliberate strategy, and understanding it changes how you see motherhood entirely. So let's actually ask the question properly. Why would a mother, an animal whose entire biological purpose seems built around protecting her offspring, turn around and consume one? Because the honest answer isn't that something has gone wrong. In most documented cases, something has gone exactly right, at least from evolution's cold, unsentimental point of view. Let's start with rabbits and rodents, because this is where the behavior shows up most visibly and most often. Researchers who study maternal behavior in rabbits, hamsters, and mice have identified a consistent pattern. This behavior spikes dramatically under conditions of acute stress. A mother who feels threatened, who senses a predator nearby, who's been disturbed too many times during a vulnerable period right after birth, or who's simply overwhelmed by a first-time birth experience, will sometimes consume one or more of her newborns almost immediately. From a purely evolutionary standpoint, this isn't random panic. It's closer to a brutal but effective damage control calculation. A stressed, exposed nest is a nest likely to be discovered by a predator anyway. Rather than risk losing the entire litter and expending enormous future energy trying and failing to protect all of them, consuming one or two weaker or more vulnerable offspring can reduce the scent signature of the nest, recover some of the nutritional investment already spent, and improve the survival odds of the remaining litter. It's a genuinely difficult thing to watch, but researchers studying this consistently describe it as adaptive behavior, not a malfunction. There's a specific, well-documented pattern breeders and researchers have noted repeatedly in domestic hamsters, one of the most commonly cited examples of this exact stress response mechanism. Female hamsters that are handled too soon after giving birth, whose nest has been disturbed by cleaning or inspection, or who simply sense unfamiliar scents around their newborns, will frequently respond by consuming some or all of the litter within the first day or two. Breeders have learned through repeated hard experience that near total isolation and minimal disturbance during this narrow postpartum window dramatically reduces this behavior, which itself is fairly strong evidence for the stress trigger explanation. It's not that the mother has stopped caring, it's that her threat detection system has been activated by exactly the kind of disturbance that, in the wild, would reliably precede a predator finding and destroying the entire nest anyway. Fish offer an even more common, and in some ways less emotionally loaded, version of this same pattern. In numerous fish species, a phenomenon researchers call filial cannibalism has been documented extensively, and it happens for reasons that are almost coldly logical. Male fish in several species that guard nests of eggs, cichlids being one particularly well-studied example, will routinely eat a portion of their own eggs during the incubation period. Studies looking closely at this behavior have found that fish appear able to detect which eggs are unfertilized, diseased, or unlikely to survive, and preferentially consume those specific eggs rather than healthy ones. This isn't random destruction. It's active nest maintenance. Removing dead or dying eggs reduces the risk of fungal infection or bacterial growth spreading to the healthy eggs nearby, essentially functioning as a form of biological quality control that happens to double as a nutritional supplement for an exhausted, fasting parent who's been guarding the nest without eating for days. It's worth pausing here for a genuinely interesting contrast, because not every species that guards eggs behaves this way, and the exception is almost as informative as the rule. Octopus mothers represent one of the more extreme counterexamples in the entire animal kingdom. A female octopus, after laying her eggs, will guard, clean, and aerate them continuously for weeks or even months without eating at all, gradually starving herself in the process. And in most species, she dies shortly after her eggs finally hatch, having invested essentially everything she has left into a single reproductive event with zero possibility of ever reproducing again. There's no cannibalism. No selective culling, no resource recovery calculation happening here at all, because the octopus's entire reproductive strategy is built around a completely different bet. One enormous all-or-nothing investment in a single clutch, rather than the kind of ongoing resource management calculation that favors occasional selective sacrifice in species that reproduce repeatedly across their lifetime. The contrast matters because it shows this isn't about some species being colder or crueler than others. It's about which specific reproductive strategy a species has evolved, and filial cannibalism only makes evolutionary sense within certain strategies, not others. birds offer a related but genuinely distinct version of the same underlying resource allocation logic, one that doesn't always involve direct cannibalism, but produces a strikingly similar outcome. In several raptor species, including certain eagles, a behavior researchers call siblicide occurs with disturbing regularity, where an older, stronger chick will actively kill a younger, weaker sibling in the nest. And in many documented cases, the parent does nothing to intervene, sometimes even feeding the aggressor while the weaker chick is being attacked. Researchers studying this have found it typically occurs specifically during years of food scarcity, when the parent's hunting success can't reliably support every chick in the nest. Rather than watching all the chicks slowly starve together or actively intervening at significant cost to herself, the parent essentially allows a brutal but efficient sorting process to run its course. One that reliably ensures at least one offspring survives to fledge, rather than risking the loss of the entire brood. It's a slightly different mechanism than direct maternal cannibalism, but it stems from the exact same underlying calculation, that in conditions of genuine scarcity, concentrating limited resources on fewer, stronger offspring can outperform spreading those same resources evenly and losing everyone. There's also a genuinely strange, related phenomenon worth mentioning on the opposite end of the parent-offspring relationship entirely, because it flips the entire premise of this video on its head. In certain spider species, researchers have documented something called matriphagy, where it's not the mother eating her offspring, but the offspring eating the mother. In some of these species, the mother will actually encourage this behavior, allowing her own spiderlings to consume her body after she's finished caring for them, essentially converting the very last of her own biological resources directly into a final meal for her surviving young. Researchers studying this describe it as one of the most extreme possible expressions of parental investment theory, a parent whose reproductive strategy has evolved toward a single, final reproductive event, quite literally giving everything, down to her own body, to maximize the survival odds of her offspring. It's a genuinely striking counterpoint to filial cannibalism, and it reinforces the same underlying point from a completely different angle, that nature's version of parental sacrifice takes wildly different forms depending on a species. Specific reproductive strategy, and none of those forms map cleanly onto simple human ideas of good or bad parenting. Primates offer a particularly interesting and genuinely more emotionally complicated version of stress-triggered maternal behavior, largely because primate social cognition sits so much closer to our own. Researchers studying primates in captivity, particularly first-time mothers in zoo and sanctuary settings experiencing unfamiliar levels of confinement, observation, or social disruption, have documented rare but real cases of maternal cannibalism or severe maternal neglect that closely mirrors the stress trigger pattern seen in rodents, just occurring in a species with a far more complex, human-recognizable emotional life. This has led many primate researchers and zoo behavioral specialists to fundamentally rethink how captive environments are designed, reducing unnecessary observation, disturbance, and stress specifically during the vulnerable postpartum period, based directly on the understanding that this behavior is a response to environmental conditions rather than some kind of inherent flaw in the individual mother. It's worth noting that this remains genuinely rare in primates compared to rodents or fish, precisely because primates, like elephants and other large mammals, invest so heavily in each individual offspring that the same cost-benefit calculation driving filial cannibalism in high litter species almost never tips in the same direction. But the fact that it can happen at all under sufficiently extreme stress, even in species this cognitively sophisticated, reinforces just how deeply this stress response mechanism appears to run. So the picture that emerges here isn't one of broken instinct or maternal failure. It's closer to an uncomfortable but genuinely rational cost-benefit calculation, running silently beneath a behavior we tend to romanticize as simple, unconditional, and absolute. Evolution doesn't actually optimize for how a behavior feels to a human observer watching from the outside. It optimizes for how many genes successfully make it into the next generation. And sometimes, in certain species, under certain specific conditions, that cold calculation results in something that looks deeply unsettling from the outside, but functions as a genuinely effective survival strategy from the inside. There's a genuinely important historical point worth adding here too, because humans have a long track record of badly misreading this exact category of animal behavior, and it's worth understanding why. For centuries, naturalists and casual observers alike tended to view any animal behavior behavior that looked cruel or shocking through an explicitly moral lens, treating it as evidence of savagery, malfunction, or a fundamental gap between animal instinct and human virtue. Modern behavioral science has largely moved away from that framing, not because the behavior itself has become any less unsettling to watch, but because researchers have increasingly recognized that applying human moral categories, good parent, bad parent, loving, cruel, to a set of evolved survival strategies fundamentally misunderstands what's actually happening. A mother rabbit consuming a stressed litter isn't failing a moral test. She's running a calculation that has, across countless generations, reliably produced more surviving descendants than the alternative would have. Understanding that distinction doesn't make the behavior any less difficult to witness, but it does replace a mistaken narrative of failure with a far more accurate and honestly more interesting story about the genuine strangeness and cleverness of evolved parental strategy. It's worth noting, too, that this entire topic sits at one extreme end of a much broader spectrum of parental sacrifice that shows up across the natural world in far gentler, far less shocking forms constantly. A bird feeding its strongest chick first while a weaker one goes hungry is making a version of the exact same calculation. A mother in a harsh environment nursing one offspring more than another is running a milder version of the same underlying math. Filial cannibalism is simply the most extreme, most visible endpoint of a spectrum of resource allocation decisions that parents across the animal kingdom, in one form or another, are making constantly, almost all of which never rise to a level dramatic enough for anyone to notice or study closely. And in a strange, indirect way, this spectrum shows up in human parenting too, just in dramatically softer, entirely non-lethal forms. A tired parent with limited time and energy inevitably making countless small allocation decisions. More attention here, less there, more resources toward one need over another every single day, almost never rising to conscious awareness, let alone anything resembling the extreme end of this same underlying evolutionary logic. So the next time you hear about an animal mother doing something that sounds shocking or cruel on the surface, it's worth pausing before assuming instinct has simply failed. More often than not, what looks like a breakdown is actually a strategy, one shaped by millions of years of trial and error, quietly running a calculation far colder and far more effective than anything as simple as unconditional love. And perhaps the most genuinely uncomfortable part of this whole topic isn't the behavior itself, but what it reveals about the story we tell ourselves regarding what parental love actually is. Not a single, uniform, universal instinct, but an enormously varied set of evolved strategies, each one shaped relentlessly by the specific pressures a given species has faced, optimized not for how it looks from the outside, but for one thing only: how many of those genes make it into tomorrow.